family's been to Ukraine 6 times now, over the last 2 years. So,
Skip, if you haven't read it, there's a very interesting article this morning in the New York Times on the extent of brain injuries in Ukraine in this war. It's a very powerful narrative.
wow, wow. I mentioned this at the conference. There was Sanjay Gupta, the CNN reporter, was one of the guest speakers. He did his talk remotely, but he had a chat, and I asked one at the question and answer. I asked him about this. Should we be paying more attention? Should there be international agencies that pay more attention to these conflict zones, these war zones, and not only develop ways to better provide care, make care more accessible, but look at it as sort of a laboratory, to be able to study what works, what of the modern day approaches to cognitive assessment and rehabilitation and so on. Now you have a controlled population to some degree. I mean, brain injury is different for every person, certainly. But when you have these numbers, this should be seen as an opportunity as well as a mission.
Well, the numbers are staggering and have to do with the nature of the kind of combat that's occurring.
Yep. Yep. World War I all over again, unfortunately. It's horrific. I My heart goes out.
Is a colleague of his. His name is Jeff Rose, and he has been to Ukraine 6 times, and he has been working with virtual reality here also. Have you heard anything of him?
No, unfortunately, no. I don't know
No,
him.
I'll take a
You have
photo.
blur, I can see.
Yeah, please send a photo of it.
No,
Jeff Rose.
no, I
No,
don't.
no, we cannot see it. No.
No,
No,
no.
no, I can see. Sorry. Well, but it's interesting. But it would be interesting to meet him.
Mhm.
Oh,
I can begin. All right. Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
We can. Mhm.
Okay. Well, here we go. Thank you so much for coming back for a second dosage of virtual reality and how it can be useful in clinical applications. I appreciate your interest, and I'll try to do my best to uh, give a more focused presentation this time on the use of VR for trauma, the work that we've done in the United States with American service members and veterans, also sexual assault survivors, and talk about the work we're trying to get started in Ukraine, the progress in that work, and hopefully have some time for discussion and questions afterwards. And as well, if any of you are shy, you can always reach out to me after the talk by email, and I'd be happy to send any papers or contacts for the people that I collaborate with, or uh, just general discussion of this topic. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to represent 4 or 5 slides that I presented at the beginning of my talk last week in case there are some new people, or just as a refresher. So my intro slides and what is VR and so on. So bear with me for the first 5 minutes. As I said last time, a couple of weeks ago, I'm at the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technologies. And over the last 25 years, we've had a lab, interdisciplinary lab, that has focused on the use of VR across 4 general areas: psychological function, cognitive, motor, and the use of virtual humans. And this is just to give you a history. This is what some of these applications looked like back in the early days. So, exposure therapy application on the upper left for PTSD in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the upper right, a virtual classroom for testing cognitive function, attention processing in children. On the bottom left, the beginnings of a program towards making game-based physical therapy so that people would be more engaged in their physical therapy and maybe do more of it and quantify their performance. And on the bottom right is our first virtual patient for clinical training. Not fully AI like we know it now, but it was a training tool where novice clinicians could practice their clinical interviewing. I'm happy to say that all of these programs or all these projects evolved into research programs. And so this is what they look like today or last year. And aside from the improvements in graphic fidelity, all of these evolved based on the research and feedback from actual patients that used the earlier versions, and that fed into the design process to evolve the work. And the good news here is that uh, not only has the technology evolved and matured and become more accessible and lower cost to be able to deliver this, the technology has caught up with the vision, but we have a strong scientific literature that documents the areas where adding in this kind of simulation technology makes an additive benefit to a clinical process. And I covered a lot of that in my last talk, and I hope that rang clear that this is no longer science fiction. This isn't Star Trek, holodeck. This is functional technology that, in fact, is being widely adopted across the Veteran Affairs hospitals in the United States. Now, when you think about VR in mental health, rehabilitation, and so forth, think of simulation technology. So, just as an aircraft simulator can test and train piloting ability under a range of controllable conditions, we can test, train, teach, and treat psychological, cognitive, and motor functioning in simulations that challenge these things. And we can do it in a clinic or a clinician's office or at home now with some of the low cost technology that's available. And in some sense, if you're a student of psychology, it's the ultimate Skinner box. At its basic level, a controlled stimulus environment that provides grand opportunities for when it makes sense for doing things clinically and in doing human research as well. So over the years, many areas have evolved, starting with anxiety disorders, specific phobias using exposure therapy, which is going to be the focus today. Um, and since that time, actually, it's been 30 years since then. We've seen rapid advancements in all of these areas that these clinical conditions. There's a large research literature on the use of virtual reality or other things that you may hear referred to as augmented reality, extended reality, mixed reality. Everybody's coming up with a new term, but it's generally a way to create immersive and interactive technology that can be applied clinically, and it's shown value. As you'll see today, some of the areas that I've listed here that I didn't get to talk about in my last talk will come up. Many reasons for this, and this is the end of my review of what I spoke about last time, but many reasons. These are um, a list of the types of advantages that VR provides. I'm not going to go into those. I did review how we could distill those advantages for VR into 5 core processes of expose or exposure therapy applications. We can distract people from painful medical procedures, which has served as a basis for pain management. Direction for VR to be applied successfully. We can motivate people to do things, make it fun, make it engaging. We can measure what goes on and give people immediate feedback and quantify their behavior change or their performance change over time. And hopefully, with this technology, we can engage people in treatment that they wouldn't ordinarily seek via traditional methods. And when we look at the idea of breaking down barriers to care, there are many barriers that prevent people from seeking treatment, not the least of which is stigma, uh, the acceptability of seeking treatment, the availability of seeking treatment, the awareness that it's out there, the anticipated benefit. These are all areas where I think VR stands to um, break down some of these barriers. And if you have an interest in how to break down barriers to care, please send me an email after the talk, and I can send you a link. There's a talk that I did last year online that specifically addressed the topic of barriers to care and how not only with this technology are we showing actual efficacy in clinical that we may serve to break down barriers. So with patients for phobias, this is just a precursor to my discussion of PTSD. But the discussion would not be complete if I didn't talk about how this field started and what was the rationale. So in the beginning, there was exposure therapy. And this was a well-matched area for virtual reality, even in the primitive days of the technology, because you could meet the theoretical basis for why exposure therapy works and why it matters. The idea, particularly with people with phobias or irrational fears, we could build simulations of the content, the context, the places, the objects that people had these fears. And we could help to do this exposure approach where you have the patient gradually approach the thing that they've been avoiding, sometimes for decades, that causes them anxiety. And by a process of repeated exposure, the theoretical rationale is that it fosters what we call extinction learning, so that when you activate the fear structures in the brain, particularly in the area around the amygdala and so on, and you do that repeatedly, but there is no negative consequence. We're talking, hardcore behavioral research here, that eventually you see the activation of the amygdala decrease and the person becomes more comfortable with the feared object. So this is for simple fears like phobias, for claustrophobia. So this is one from 1997 from the early days. This was Christine Batella's work in Spain, in Madrid. And basically, it was a claustrophobia application where they put somebody in this virtual room and they would close the door and they could gradually move the wall in. And in that way, even though it doesn't look very real, people got that sense of claustrophobic reaction, but you could do it gradually at a pace that the patient could handle, at a pace that the patient could control. These objects in the middle of the screen here, the red and the blue objects, were ways for the patient to go and stand in front of this and actually have, and were empowered to control the distance of the walls and so forth. Um, as I said, and I mentioned this last week, um, this is another example for fear of heights. And as I mentioned last week, you would never mistake that for the real thing. But one of the first things we did learn using VR with patients, and particularly people with phobias who are very primed to react to anything that looks or feels or creates the experience of what they're fearful of, that we could fool the brain. That in spite of the fact that this cartoonish world didn't look that realistic, when you were wearing a VR headset and you saw it in 3 dimensions, you had the sense of depth that people, the frontal lobes are saying it's just a simulation, but the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, is activating. You're activating that fear structure. And by doing that repeatedly with no negative consequence over time and helping patient cognitively develop a sense of empowerment, they would show reductions in the fear as well. They would, in real life, make changes and maybe be able to take a job on the third floor of an office building without freaking out every time they walked by a window, and so forth. Things like that. Fear of heights, actually, we kind of chuckle at it, but it's very debilitating. So, my point again here, one of the first laws of VR that we picked up, it didn't always have to be an exact replica of the reality that was being modeled for it to have an emotional impact. We have an emotionally evocative technology here. Um, so, good news is that technology has gotten much better. It looks more realistic, as you see here. And here are some examples. And these are 4 or 5 years old, each one of these. They're not brand new, but the field has evolved, and these applications are getting better, with different. Now there's a marketplace, and so there's competition. So companies are competing with each other as to the quality of the simulations they use. But there's still a question: how real does it have to be? We know that even if it's not so real, it can evoke, significant reactions. So anyway. With that, I want to point out another direction that started to evolve, and this is with using delivering exposure therapy, but more independently to patients. So this was a study by Dan Freeman at Oxford, where he built a fear of heights scenario that he put in a standalone VR headset. A headset doesn't require a computer. All the processing is done on the headset. And he had a whole program for fear of heights. And he had this little character here play the role of a guide that would help guide you through the various types of simulations. And he sent the headset home with people to do the exposure outside of the clinician's office in the comfort of their home. Now, the clinician was still involved in the diagnosis, the selection for the study, the treatment planning, making sure that this was, in fact, a legitimate fear of heights and not something else, so that, it was this very specific controlled study. But it did show that patients with supervision by a clinician could achieve benefit beyond what they would get with standard care. Or, I mean, it was really equivalent to in person care, but better than no care. And a lot of times people can't or won't come in for in person care. Now, I'm not saying people should be able to download self care VR environments when it comes to a significant mental health problem. I think a clinician needs to be in the loop for a good assessment, diagnosis, treatment planning, monitoring the progress in the treatment plan, seeing what other things come up. Sometimes you fix one problem and it's like whack a mole, another problem comes up. That is really the real problem. Anybody who's done therapy sees that happen. So I think this is an area that we can provide hope for promoting access to care, but we can't immediately think this is all self-help and we don't need clinicians anymore. And he's taken this work and expanded it to actually applying it with persons with mild schizophrenia, but with agoraphobia, people who had a hard time leaving their homes. And so this was a well-matched application. Um, it's called Game Change. It's a commercially available application now, and it provides a wide range of everyday social environments. And so you can see the spectrum of environments and virtual people, because people are relevant in these kinds of phobias as well. And so this was from 2022 published in Lancet, a positive study using this implementation with a population with pretty severe mental health challenge. Here's the paper. And, no adverse side effects, significant reductions in agoraphobic avoidance and distress at 6 weeks. So anyway, I think we still have a lot more research to do in this area. But when you have a population, a world population that the World Health Organization claims there's 1 billion people on the planet with a mental health condition, of which 2/3 will never see the inside of a therapy office, maybe making it so care is a little bit more accessible. I would hesitate to make this just something that's available online and anybody can just use it without a clinician's advice, guidance, or follow up. But this is what we have to study. Okay, so overall, the research in using VR for these kinds of anxiety disorders has been positive. This is from 2008. My group on the right and another group both published meta-analyses reviewing the science up to that point, and we found that VR was equivalent and in some cases better than the traditional imagination-only therapy, and that people were more likely to want to do it in VR. In 2015, this meta-analysis came out, and the important finding here was that it wasn't just improvements on self-rating scales. They actually tested out or studied things in the real world, behaviors. Did people actually fly after doing fear of flying exposure? Could they do a behavioral test in a lab where if they had a spider or snake phobia, they would walk closer or be able to actually handle a snake or a spider. I might choke on that one myself when it comes to the snakes. But um, anyway, so what's done in VR clinically translates to the real world in many cases. Look, it's not 100% here. We're always talking in probabilistic terms when we talk about clinical care with human beings, but the data is positive in this area. And more recently, actually, it's not recent anymore, it's 5 years ago, a full issue in the Journal of Anxiety Disorders came out, which there was a more up-to-date meta-analysis that came out. And these are with, people that are leaders in the field: Emily Carl, Mark Powers, Pierre Karlbring, Barbara Rothbaum. It's just, if anybody doubts that this is a useful tool, and some old school clinicians still are opposed to the use of VR for whatever their reasons. Um, but that's old school. I'm sorry. This has generated enough research where we can say it's an evidence-based approach, and it gives patients the opportunity to make a choice, have options for their treatment. Now, translating this to overcoming traumatic experiences. Well, the same process that we believe underlies the um, the clinical mechanism of action for exposure therapy for phobias, fear heights, spiders, public speaking, and so on. Um, the same process we believe is applied for PTSD when we talk about trauma-focused therapies, like prolonged exposure, EMDR, cognitive processing therapy, and so forth, narrative therapy in some ways. These all involve helping the patient to confront their fear, their trauma, their anxiety, and hopefully in the course of that confrontation, you have the behavioral effect of reduction of that activation, but you also have some cognitive processing that goes along with it, that it's not just a pure behavioral, stimulus response therapy. There's a lot more, especially when you talk about complex PTSD, where there's a lot of existential issues and moral injury and a wide variety of things. So, what I want to say before I dig into this deeper is that using VR for PTSD has a firm foothold in behavioral science, but it provides the opportunity to help a patient to reprocess their experience by putting them in simulations that prevent them from avoiding this process. That's a big thing. We're trying to prevent avoidance, and that the benefits in the hands of a well-trained clinician can be significant. So with that little intro, we're not the first people to do this. These are all applications that were built before we began our work with virtual Iraq and Afghanistan. That's virtual Vietnam on the left, motor vehicle, PTSD, World Trade Center, and a bus bombing scenario. And as you can tell just by watching those video clips, it wasn't just the visuals, because of course the visuals don't look like the real thing so much. The audio was a big driver of the emotional response. And so being able to systematically control the level of audio stimulation is also an element of good virtual reality in this area. And so our goal here is to help patients engage in their trauma memories and to do it at a pace they can handle. They're active when they're doing this therapy. They're not passively just sitting in a video game. They're narrating their experience at whatever level they can at that point, and the clinician is controlling the stimuli in the environment in real time to mimic that trauma narrative. And with VR, I think we can do it in a controlled fashion beyond what's done traditionally with pure imaginal revisiting or imaginal exposure, that we can engage people in ways that we might not be able to do if we rely exclusively on effortful memory retrieval. You're actually in traditional exposure therapy, you're trying to get somebody to do what they've been spending the last year or decade doing. You're trying to get them to stop avoiding. You're getting them to engage in something that's very painful, very difficult. It's hard medicine for a hard problem. But without doing that process, I don't believe um, I don't believe you're going to get the longer term clinical effects. That you have to have some focus on the trauma to help people to get beyond it. And very hard therapy, no question about that. Okay, so we got started in this area, and I'm not sure if if Carl is on the call today, but this was a paper he co-authored, Charles Hogue, that really began recognition in the United States that PTSD was a significant issue that needed to be dealt with in military populations that were in Iraq and Afghanistan, a little more so in Iraq, according to this data. Um, and this actually, we had built a simulation of Iraq and showed it off at military conferences and at scientific conferences. We built a prototype and we applied for funding. We couldn't get any funding. This was before this paper came out. And right after the paper came out, I was approached by uh, a, a project manager at the Office of Naval Research. And he said, I've heard you've got a simulation of Iraq, and I'd like to see this get evolved. And there's a program you can apply for funding. And that is how we got started in this area. If it wasn't for this paper, it might not have happened. This was a call to arms. And I've seen many papers like this about the current situation in Ukraine, so we don't have to rely on history. We don't have to rely on history here to um, to make a justification for the need. And of course, PTSD continues to be a challenge. A lot of people that did never sought treatment in the beginning and have endured a lot of pain over the years, are now beginning to come in. It amazes me, how people will suffer and not seek treatment. I always make the analogy that when you have a toothache, you go to the dentist. You want that pain to stop. Nobody likes going to the dentist, but you go because you know you're going to get relief. We need to do a better job selling the concept that therapy does provide similar relief. It might take a little longer, it may be a little harder, but that we can make a difference by getting care, much better than not getting care. Um, Now, the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Science in the United States, or in 2008, began looking at these areas of treatment and found that there wasn't a lot of great therapy for PTSD at that time that had evidence, but there was sufficient data to conclude that exposure therapies in a cognitive behavioral format were effective in treating people with PTSD. So that was a little more endorsement that we were on the right track with our work. So in 2004, before we got funded, we took a video game and built out a simulation from this video game. It's this street right here in the bottom in the middle. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what that looked like. This was the VR simulation in 2004. And the clinician could put somebody in this in a headset, could hit a button and produce crowd or ambient sounds. As I said, sound is important. You could hit another button and introduce the sound of weapons. You could hit another button, bring a helicopter in. And what we did with this, we had built this prototype and we evolved it a little bit further than what you're seeing. And we actually sent it to Iraq with one of my former graduate students who was in the military, Greg Rieger. And he actually tested it with people in Iraq to get their feedback, which is essential. So what you're seeing here is Greg in Iraq with a service member in Iraq, in virtual Iraq. And that feedback was essential to tell us if we were on the right track. Were we creating something that was relevant for the user population? And this is a principle of all VR development, the idea that you want to incorporate your targeted user group, your patient population, in the early phases of design. Now, he wasn't doing therapy here. He was just getting boots on the ground to weigh in. This was helpful because it guided when we got funded our next development. This was some of the data from 93 people weighing in on average on some of the things we needed to do. So here is what the next generation of the simulation looked like. Still quite primitive, but this was usable. This was usable for clinical treatment, even though it wasn't as comprehensive as I would have liked. We only had 4 worlds, and 3 of them were driving. We had a small Middle Eastern city that we built, but it wasn't. It was good enough, but it fell short with some patients where we didn't have the context that was specific to their experience. But we were able to reach out to, as you'll see in the data, we were quite successful in spite of that. So this is what we use then. But here is somebody you may recognize if you watch much American news. In 2006, trying his experience with VR, he had been in Iraq as a correspondent and as a doctor. And here is his experience after trying this simulation.
I have to tell you, I was stunned by my reaction. I mean, I know it's only a simulation, but my reaction was so powerful. What I didn't show you was that I went through that simulation 2 more times. And I can't say that it ever really got any easier, but I did feel more in control. And from what the psychologists tell me, that's the goal. Face your fears until you can control them, maybe even defeat them.
So, I hope most of you recognize Sanjay Gupta. He's a good guy, and he's done a number of pieces on our continuing evolution of the work. He's a real fan. And he had had a difficult experience when he was in Iraq and when he was in the virtual Humvee driving down a roadway, experiencing an attack on the vehicle. It brought back a deep memory. If you were to watch the whole video, you would see him reacting in that context. And that video is on my YouTube channel. If you go to my YouTube channel, Albert Skip Rizzo, you scroll through, you'll find Sanjay Gupta. Okay, this is where we're at now. 14 diverse, customizable worlds.
By going through it there, it's not going through my head at night when I'm trying to sleep or when I'm with my wife, when times when I don't want it to come up and me start thinking about it. Traumatic things are not normal. You cannot handle the things that you've seen and done. And this is a tool that has helped me out tremendously.
Reliving the worst moments of his life has helped him to move on with his life.
I'm probably about 80% of who I was before I left, but I think that's pretty good after seeing and doing the things that we've done.
For Nightline, this is Dan Harris in Atlanta.
Okay, so one thing to keep in mind, we've got this diverse content. We've got a lot of science, as you'll see, supporting its use. But we've got to get we got to get past the idea that this is self-help, which some people believe it should be. I think this is a tool designed, um, designed for expanding or extending the skills of a well-trained clinician. You can support some independent use, but a clinician that's well-trained in trauma-focused therapy needs to be guiding the treatment. The technology doesn't fix anyone. It's a tool in the hands of a well-trained healthcare professional. And the way they do that is what the interface looks like. I know this looks daunting, but it's very learnable, and it allows the clinician, as you see in this image, to see what the patient sees in the VR headset as they navigate and turn their head and look around, and control everything that goes on in the world, the time of day, whether there's clouds in the sky, whether there's a helicopter circling or a jet flying over or a bomb coming in or a baby crying. We have a lot of audio clips, as I mentioned. In fact, on these left, the two columns here are just a listing of some of the different types of audio clips that the clinician can introduce. And so it does take a little bit of training. We provide 1.5 day trainings at the VA just to help people that are already experienced in doing exposure therapy learn how to use the software to do it in VR. So there is a little bit of a learning curve, but it's very learnable. Okay. We also, as I mentioned, we have good sound, but we also run the sound through subwoofers in a platform that the patient can stand on or put a chair on so that they're driving the Humvee or the vehicle. They feel that a bomb goes off. They can feel the concussive force through their body, through this vibrotactile stimulation. We also use scent machines and different physical props. And this is an American scent machine that we were looking at, olfactory VR, and it fits under the headset. And it's wireless, and it puffs out little microblasts of scent. Not good scents, but scents like gunpowder, cordite, burning rubber, rotting garbage, things common to a battlefield. There's a company in Ukraine now that has reached out to us that has a similar technology that we're hoping to integrate into our system in Ukraine. The fellow is a really good guy. I'm blanking on his name now, but if you're interested in reaching out to him, I can connect you with him. But um, we don't have data to say by adding scent you're going to get better clinical outcomes, but we do know that the sense of smell is tightly connected in the limbic system to emotion and memory. And many patients using our older system, which was much more cumbersome, that device that blew the scent into the whole room. There were some patients that when they would smell some of these artificial scents, gunpowder, burning rubber, diesel fuel, it brought them back. So I think there's a value in it. Might not be for everyone, but if you can deliver it in a very easy fashion like this, I think it could be a powerful sensation to address. We also, use physical props. People navigate holding on to a fake weapon because soldiers told us right from the get-go, right from the beginning, that it was okay to use a gamepad to drive a vehicle, but when they were on a foot patrol, they would never be without their weapon. So we put the navigational controls on this fake weapon. And so you're holding on to the physical prop. Another thing to enhance the sense of realism and relevance and listening to the user population. Okay. And here's an example of what that looks like. And this is in Norway. We modified a little bit of the content, and he's on a omnidirectional treadmill. This is like $10,000. This isn't for everybody. But their belief was that by actually the physical act of walking and that physical turning, that would get a better outcome. And so they're experimenting with that in Norway. And so Norway, Denmark, Canada, Australia, these are countries that we've modified our content a little bit for their purposes, like what we're doing now in Ukraine. So the clinical research, I know I've been talking about how this is evidence-based, but let me walk through real quick. Our first clinical trial started in 2000, uh, end of 2005, beginning of 2006, just an open clinical trial. We got very good outcomes, and these were people that had tried treatment in some form in the past and achieved no benefit, service members and veterans. And you can see significant reductions in PTSD symptoms based on self-report that prevailed at 3 months. This is the actual data points for the 16 that no longer met PTS criteria at the end of treatment. One looks like they rebounded at 3 months a little bit, but he had had an event, marital event happen the day before we reached out on the 3 month follow-up. But you can see the improvements that are relatively well sustained over time, and four that did not benefit. It's like I said, it's not 100%. So that was very encouraging for a first clinical trial, but more currently, I mean, these are studies. This is one from 2017, and then a later study in 2019 produced similar results. This is dramatic reduction in PTSD, but this was done in an intensive format, not weekly sessions, but this was done by Deborah Bidell, the University of Central Florida, where patients would fly into Orlando and stay for 3 weeks, stay in a hotel, and they got exposure therapy using VR every morning. And then in the afternoon, they did a combination of customized, what they call trauma management therapy, which is a collection of traditional therapies that address the comprehensive package of things that people with PTSD may be going through, whether it's just pure grief or whether it's anger problems, whether it's substance use. So that combination therapy with the VR integrated as the pivotal exposure treatment every morning and done in an intensive format led to an effect size of 2.06, which you rarely see that high in clinical studies. And now this practice of trying to get patients to intensively focus over, over a period of time, like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, this is becoming more common. Barbara Rothbaum's center at Emory, one of the world leading centers, has adopted this approach as well for patients that can do it. Some patients have to do a weekly session, but when you can, this is the way to go. And mentioning Barbara Rothbaum, she had done a study published in 2014 where she tracked patients up to a year to see if there would be a benefit. Now, usually the people that you can still get a hold of after a year are usually the people that are the ones that benefited. So there's a little bias in this, but it's a large sample and it showed continued gains. Once you get people over this hump at post-treatment and then they start to engage in the world, they start to get better kind of on their own because they're not as bottled up. They're not hiding out in their basement. They're engaging with people. They're developing social interactions that they had avoided. So anyway, that's some data on that. As well, in that study, they also looked at physiological reactivity in that patient group. And it was a startle response. And we know with PTSD, people are hyper aroused so that they oftentimes react as if it's a threat everywhere. Well, in this study that was correlated, it was done with that patient population, you saw decreases in startle response, the physiological reactivity, and also saw cortisol reactivity go down, the stress hormone, when people were in a simulation that was relevant to their trauma experience, that their reactivity in terms of production of the stress hormone reduced. And there's papers on all this I can send. The first hardcore randomized control trial used our second version. It only had 4 worlds. So it was limited, and particularly limited in Afghan content. We built out for Iraq first. And in spite of that, it was equivalent when compared to traditional prolonged exposure, although it didn't have the same maintenance of gains at 3 or 6 months as a traditional method. But it was using a limited set of tools. But it was a well-done study, and a lot of people benefited. Now, the latest randomized control trial using the latest system that we built out that had a comprehensive, diverse package of content. We got, again, it was as good as traditional exposure therapy. Our exposure therapy group in imagination actually did quite well relative to other studies. It was a well done study. And so that was fair enough. It's equivalent to the best evidence-based approach. But in our pre-planned predictions before we ran the study, we documented what our hypothesis was. We said that people with comorbid depression and PTSD would do better in VR. And that, in fact, was an outcome that we outperformed traditional therapy with people that were also depressed, people that are hard to engage in trauma-focused therapy. So we have, again, an emotionally evocative approach here that now, if I was to have a patient come in and their assessment showed that they were not only PTSD, it was complex PTSD with depression and other things, I would recommend VR. If they just had PE, I would say, if they just had PTSD, textbook PTSD, then I would say, well, we got choice. Do you want to do it in VR or do you want to do it in imagination? And when you empower patients to make decisions sometimes about their therapy, sometimes they do a little bit better. So the largest study in the literature controlled randomized controlled trial. And we also found that 76% when asked at the beginning of the study, if they had a choice, what would they pick? 76% would have chosen VR. So now we have a preference that might be useful for getting people into therapy that wouldn't come in otherwise for traditional methods. Okay, we've done work with military sexual trauma. This is a spin-off of our work where we had the content that we built off of the Afghan and Iraq content, but we also found out that sexual trauma in the U.S. military, a lot was happening on U.S. bases in the United States. So we had to build out civilian content. As you see here, here's an example of being in an alley, walking to your car perhaps, and a perpetrator that is customizable could follow you or turn up. And that's very provocative. Clinicians were very careful in if they even used that, because that really brought people to the top of the hierarchy. And so they had to be careful. Because of the sensitive nature of sexual trauma as opposed to combat trauma, we were only allowed to do a safety and feasibility trial with a small sample. We ran 11 patients through this. And the good news is, and this was done independently, this was done Barbara Rothbaum's lab in Emory University. We don't do the studies at our lab. We give it to centers that collect the data, so there's no bias from the developer. Anyway, what we found was no adverse effects. Patients didn't freak out in the course of doing this very provocative exposure to the settings and the places and the events in the virtual world that were reminiscent of their trauma. In addition to that, even with a small sample size, we had statistically significant and clinically meaningful reductions in PTSD symptoms with this population, as you see here. And I can send this paper to you if you have an interest. This came out in that 2019 version, special issue of Journal of Anxiety Disorders. And this system now is going through a complete revamping that is going to make it available not only for military sexual trauma, but for sexual trauma of civilians and so on. It may have relevance in the horrific events that have happened in Ukraine at the hands of these Russian perpetrators. Okay. So we've expanded content for combat medic and corpsman. Sometimes, we don't have a lot of blood and guts in our scenarios. People that really study prolonged exposure and trauma focus says you don't want to habituate people to things they should have a natural reaction to. But for combat medics, we needed to have a little bit more provocative content. So we have that in there. We've also been involved in having this content be used for an assessment of PTSD. So you put people in simulations and you look at their physiological reactivity as maybe a more objective way of determining maybe somebody's trying to be the tough guy and say, no, I don't have PTSD. And they check no to all the symptoms on a self report, but you put them in a simulation where some of this stuff comes up, and all of a sudden you see startle response, you see slow recovery, and so on. So that's what these studies aim to do. And there's another one I have to add to this that just came out as well. So it's an active area of research as well. There was one study looking at fMRI, looking at brain activation before and after treatment. And while you're watching a simulation of a combat environment. And what you see here are changes in areas of the brain activation, like the amygdala. You're seeing a reduction in activation pre and post treatment. And this, I think we need to do way more brain research in this area to better understand what activates people and um, how we can better design treatment for them. Okay, one other thing. This is a project that I'm partnering with a company on to build out everyday environments that veterans often report avoiding. We call it in vivo exposure when you ask your patient to go to a crowded supermarket or a restaurant with where your back isn't to the wall watching the door, but you're in the middle of things and in crowded areas, maybe around fireworks, like 4th of July in the United States. So we're building out real world video. It's actually spherical video. You put on the headset and you look around, and you're in a 360 video world. And here's what that looks like. This is one example of a restaurant and one example of a grocery store that gets more and more crowded, and you're by the meat rack.
Are you ready to order?
Can I get you?
You know, that's an application that you can send home with a patient between sessions where they can start to approach places in everyday life that they've been avoiding that bring up memories of the trauma. Um, anyway, I can talk about that that's a whole separate research area because we have ways that a clinician can be with the patient even at home in the VR headset. We can zoom in a therapist who is at their clinic, and then the patient schedules, all right, I'm going to go in, I'm going to spend 20 minutes in this crowded restaurant with a lot of noise, and the therapist can pop up in a little zoom window in the VR headset and see what the patient is seeing on their computer screen as they turn their head and look around, and talk to the patient as they go through it. So a lot of ways to get this out. Anyway, this stuff, we have to reconceptualize traditional therapy, and maybe we look at it as post-deployment reset training, whatever. May appeal to a generation of soldiers who've grown up digital as well as a wider population. And as we know from the study I mentioned earlier, the randomized control trial, it's also a preferred treatment in this randomized control trial. So this project has been supported by an organization, Soldier Strong, which donates all the equipment to any veteran hospital in the United States that wants it and provides the clinical training to clinicians. And we've got it out to about 40 sites, the latest version that they have helped us to support. They've also given us the funding to update the sexual trauma content as well. And they're strong partners that have helped us out, over 40 sites across the country as well. They've donated 58 systems for physical and cognitive therapy, working with this company that I consult with, Penumbra, which develops ways for physical therapy. And as someone mentioned before my talk, this may be an interest following brain injury from a combat wound, physical and cognitive therapy. And I have some of these companies on board to become partners as we move forward with the projects in Ukraine. Now, as I alluded to at the end of my talk last week, I was going to talk about where we're at with the Ukraine project. Certainly, this is from 2022, 2 years down the road now. We know that we have a significant challenge on our hands. Ukraine right now, as well as Gaza and Israel, it's a petri dish of trauma. And aside from um, the ethical drive to make a difference for people that are suffering this horrific trauma, it's an opportunity to study how well we can advance the treatment of trauma. So if you're a scientist, it's a good thing. But if you're a clinician that's concerned about helping people, I think we have great opportunities. So let me stop for a second and give a lead in. And I want to warn people, what you're going to see is the beginning of a simulation. We gave our BraveMind software to a developer in Ukraine, and they are building out the content that's relevant for Ukrainians. The first world we picked was a rural village that had been captured by Russian military. And you can navigate through this village. What you're gonna see is from the perspective of being in a broken down, bomb damaged home, hiding, and you're gonna see Russian tanks, and you're going to see Russian soldiers, all that are controllable by the clinician. Now, that patient that you're seeing the patient wearing the headset could navigate out there, could navigate in this world, depending on what their trauma was. And we could make bombs go off, and we can have people getting shot, whatever the trauma focus is of the patient, we can recreate with digital technology if it's clinically informed. But here's what that looks like. First off, the tank scenario, then the soldier scenario, and then you'll see a second world that's being created with a city environment with missiles coming in. You can make it so a soldier peels off and starts approaching the house. Everything in the world is controllable so that depending on the patient's trauma experience can be adjusted. And here's the city environment, being in a tall building and missiles coming in. Sound effects can be put in or taken out.
Each stage of the scenario can last either a few seconds or a few minutes when the patient is ready for it. We use an AI voiceover as it provides enough realism to allow the patient to become immersed in the events they have experienced. The events can include scenes of brutality with people killed or injured, but can also be quite neutral. the level of emotional complexity can be adjusted based on therapeutic needs by selecting an appropriate rating for the content.
Okay.
That is, one can choose an R rating or a softer rating within a scene. As mentioned earlier, these events can be almost anything. Furthermore, the same events can unfold in different locations.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. I hope that wasn't too provocative for audience members that have had those experiences, but I think it's important to see we can activate emotions, and hopefully we can do this in a way that's therapeutic at a pace that the patient can handle, to invoke this process. The other projects we're doing, one is a metaverse world where we took a spherical image of a popular square in Kyiv, and patients can, from their laptop or in a VR headset, occupy an avatar in this space for clinician facilitated social support. So here's what it looks like. You may recognize this place in Kyiv. It's very easy to build because you can use a lot of this spherical content that's available, and you have a screen in case you want to pop something up. But patients can gather, and here's our first pilot test.
Нам о своем опыте переезда в Румынию.
Я приехала в Румынию со своими дочками. У меня 2 дочки. Столкнулась с проблемой языкового барьера. Конечно, первое время было тяжело. Но я записалась на курсы и в ближайшее время туда пойду.
Джулас, хотите что-то добавить или рассказать?
That's the clinician.
Я приехала в Румынию с семьей, уже лежала в раннем марте, и очень сложно было адаптироваться к общественному транспорту.
Okay, so that is a totally different approach. It's not for trauma focus, but it's for helping people to gather. And sometimes when you have an avatar representation of yourself, you feel more comfortable sharing your experience. And you have a clinician there that can guide you towards opportunities, whether it's to address the mundane challenges of living in another country or dealing with grief or getting the support of others or helping direct a person to treatment. This is being done in Bucharest right now, and the study that will be done, it's actually, I think it's just getting off the ground right now, is to do an RCT comparing a waitlist group with the metaverse versus an in-person group therapy approach. So we'll see how that works, but I think it's a useful application. For children, this is an application that's already in Ukraine. It's Jessica Stone's sand tray, virtual sand tray, a play therapy approach that lets a child construct a world from an iPad that allows them to build out a world that represents their story, helping children be able to tell their trauma narrative without being confrontive, without being overly provocative. And then they can put on a headset and walk around with their therapist and describe their experience. And as I said, this is already being used in Ukraine. So this is a top-down view. You can put on the headset and actually be in this world. But these are examples of what children in Ukraine have created. So it's a way for them in a non-provocative, well, it's as provocative as they want to make it, as you see here. And here, children can build out these worlds and use it to tell their stories, because we know that children often don't have the words, and sometimes they have misconceptions. Sometimes they take responsibility errantly that, that a good clinician needs to help address. And sometimes, there's some hope. Sometimes they build fantasy worlds about what they want to live in the future, and talk about their pets and talk about, their brothers and sisters and so on. And we know this is important. The United States has a strong interest in addressing adverse childhood experiences because they do have a direct effect on behavior and physical and mental health. The more of these adverse events, the more potential problems you have in young and later adulthood. And we also know that it makes you more susceptible to PTSD later in life. In this study, it was shown that people that had a larger number of adverse childhood events when they were assaulted physically in adulthood at 6 months follow-up, they had a higher level of PTSD, higher incidence of PTSD. And if you're interested, I can send this meta-analysis on the impact of adverse childhood events on children in terms of, adverse childhood events, sexual abuse, childhood physical abuse, dysfunctional household, emotional neglect. These all have impacts in later life from this, according to this meta-analyses as well. On the horizon, the other areas that we're going to be bringing into our total toolkit for Ukraine, I'm developing partnerships with companies, one in the area of mindfulness, meditation, and relaxation. And this is the idea of using VR as a calming experience, as a way to teach people mindfulness, meditation, put them in a world that's different than the everyday world that they're in. And there are companies that are producing this. These are companies that have built these. In fact, Tier 1 is out of Poland, right up the road from you guys. But these are examples of what these worlds look like. And we may have Trip on board. They're still deciding if they're going to donate their software into our total program that we're building. But you can see the different natures of these worlds. The ones that we do have are these. Well, here we go. The Dolphin Swim Club, where you wear the headset, you're in with dolphins and you have calming things. The Sanctuary by Firefly, which provides a wide range of options for helping people to meditate, to experience calming environments, and so forth as well. Beat Saber in the bottom left, this is a commercial product. It's just a game, but it promotes physical action and a little bit of cognitive training. Virtual Leap on the right has committed to being part of the program. They have a cognitive assessment program that will be out next month, a 30-minute test of cognitive function, as well as brain training activities. So these are things we're bringing to bear, on the horizon. You just have to be careful because, there's too many things that you can be doing, as well as the physical and cognitive rehabilitation activities, like some of the work that we've done here. These are systems that we've built at our center. And as we get a foothold and as we get more donations to be able to support the work, because that's an active thing that we're trying to do, is raise funding to be able to buy equipment, to set it up, to cover training costs, and all the things. It's probably the financial end of it's probably less relevant in Ukraine as it is in the United States, where we have a pay-to-play healthcare system. It's almost criminal. But the good news is, in all the work that I showed up until this has all been built on sweat equity and people donating their time and their applications, and being built in some cases in Ukraine or in Bucharest, with Ukrainian consultants. So, and the data on physical therapy is very positive using VR. I mentioned that in my last talk, so I'm going to stop there. As I mentioned, Soldier Strong is the agency that's helping us raise money. We've raised a little over $10,000. Our partnerships with the University of Bucharest, with the International Institute of Postgraduate Education in Kyiv, Agora, which is the metaverse company, Fountain Digital Labs, which is run by a Ukrainian woman out of London, but using Ukrainian developers. They've developed on our Brave Mind app. So I had another section on virtual human work, but I've gone way over time. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump out of this now and open up for questions. and maybe another day I'll come back and talk about how AI and virtual humans can be used for therapy, and we're using it right now. In fact, you know what? Before I jump out, I'm going to show an application we're doing for suicide prevention in the U.S. military. This is a mobile app that's a battle buddy. It's somebody that you can talk to anytime that can help guide your experience through your, you know, it can be your support agent, and particularly for suicide prevention.
Hello there, and welcome to Battle Buddy, where we combine conversational AI, sensing, wearables, and mobile technology to provide evidence-based wellness content, create and walk veterans in crisis through their personal suicide safety plan, and connect them to appropriate care when needed. My name is Kevin, and I'll be guiding you through our vision for suicide prevention and wellness. No one should ever have to face their toughest moments alone. Everyone deserves a non-judgmental friend that is there when they need them the most. That's what I'm here for. I won't let our vets down. Together, we're stronger. I'm a friend, a partner, a buddy. I've got your six. I am your battle buddy. Thank you for your time.
This is a project that the Veterans Affairs Office has funded, and it's evolving. You can have different characters, you can be civilian and so on. And here is the head of the Veteran Affairs in the United States talking about it recently at an event.
And veteran-centric innovation is what our Mission Daybreak grantees are after to help end veteran suicide. I just walked past one of the booths out front. I'm thinking about Battle Buddy innovators out at the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technologies. They're working with Soldier Strong to see if interactive AI can help assess a vet's potential for suicidal ideation, prevent a suicidal crisis, and connect vets to mental health interventions they need in that moment.
Okay, so I'm actually gonna stop here. Jump out of this. I'm sorry I went way over time, but I'm available for as long as you need to answer questions.
Скіп, ми хотіли в якості відповіді, в якості дискусії запропонувати нашій колезі, яка в Україні займається питаннями віртуальної реальності, розповісти про її досвід. І потім, можливо, запитати, по-перше, щоб слухачі це почули, побачили, що воно, правда, в Україні живе і існує. Ось. А по-друге, щоб так, створити поле для дискусії наших слухачів був і ваш досвід, який ви розказали, і, власне, досвід нашої колеги-українки. Оля, чи ти тут? Я не подивилась.
Ой, так, Оксано, я тут, і дякую дуже за цю нагоду. Зараз я гляну. У мене є можливість шерити екран. Я буду набагато більш лаконічною. І я собі дозволю, але все-таки з тих 15 хвилин, про які ми домовлялися, я собі дозволю півхвилинки взяти на те, щоб подякувати команді Форпосту за роботу. Ви робите надзвичайну роботу. Це прямо якась така трошки меджик, коли ти спочатку за якісь там півроку, рік читаєш людину в журналі, а потім вона у вас на вебінарі, і це не тільки стосовно цього вебінару, але й багатьох інших ваших заходів. Тому дякую, натхнення вам, продовжуйте, будь ласка. І я, власне, переходжу до того, що я хотіла би розказати. Власне, компанія, яку я маю сьогодні честь представляти, називається Speechy. Я є Ольга Кухарук, кандидатка психологічних наук, і я очолюю, власне, напрямок психологічного і Research and Development в компанії. Це фактично є американський стартап, який зареєстрований в Америці, але українськими засновниками, і ми працюємо в Україні. І фактично більшість наших працівників базується тут. І ми маємо наші...
Олечка, почекай.
Так?
Оль, ти так не поспішай, тому що тебе перекладачі ж перекладають, щоб їм
О,
було
сорі,
зручно.
бачиш, я спішу з тим, щоб...
Встигнути, я зрозуміла, так. Але
Щоб
я думаю, що їм
встигнути,
важко,
але
тому
я...
так.
Так, перепрошую перекладачів. Окей. Власне, наші напрями, це, як очевидно, вже є психологічний напрям, і це робота з військовими ветеранами, але також цивільними. В компанії також є напрям культурної дипломатії, і тут ви можете бачити, наприклад, є проекти, присвячені музею Примаченко зруйнованому, чи музею зруйнованому в Охтирці. Є проекти, які присвячені документації військових злочинів. І так само є один з напрямів, це є підтримка обороноздатності країни і певні військові проекти. Власне, я би хотіла трошки розказати про нас, і одна з основних наших цінностей є, власне, бути в контексті війни і контексті України. Ми не даремно знаходимося в Україні, ми давно працюємо з цією темою, ну, зокрема, я і мої колеги працюють з військовими і ветеранами ще з АТО, з антитерористичної операції. І для нас дуже важливо знати цю війну, знати, що відбувається в нас в країні, для того, щоб видавати продукт, який буде орієнтований на наші реалії. А відповідно до цього ми дуже є орієнтовані на травмочутливий підхід і на відповідальність перед тим, з ким ми працюємо. Ми знаємо, якими є наші реалії, що може бути травматичним контекстом, на що звертати увагу. Відповідно, через це ми маємо постійний контакт з клініками. Ми звертаємо увагу на різні види реабілітації, різні види роботи. Ми добре знаємо, як організована психологічна допомога, різні види психологічної допомоги, хто є ті люди, які її надають, на що ми можемо орієнтуватись, а на що не можемо. Це теж є дуже важлива історія. І які є терміни реабілітації, які є задачі реабілітації в різних клініках. Це все для нас є дуже важливе для того, щоб продукт був максимально пристосований для, власне, українських умов, які є доволі специфічними і є мало порівнювані з світовим контекстом, з тим, як відбувається це, ну, скажімо, в країнах, які мають більше можливостей для відновлення і безпеки.
Оля, я знову застрибну, вибачай, будь ласка, у нас не змінюються слайди на екрані, так і має бути? Тільки перший.
Зараз має бути слайд з військовим і колом.
Ні, нема ніякого кола. Ні, у нас
так.
заглавний оцей слайд.
Секундочку, давайте ще раз будемо пробувати. В Zoom є такий нюанс. Скажіть, будь ласка, що ви бачите?
Коло бачимо, супер.
Все, супер. Власне, так, це я розказую про наші цінності. З іншої сторони, нам є вкрай важливо бути в курсі того, що роблять світові індустрії, і ми так само знаємо про ці ініціативи, які працюють, і ми, власне, маємо так само є власний відділ Research and Development, розробки і досліджень, але так само маємо партнерства, працюємо з українськими інституціями, розбудовуємо іноземні партнерства. В нашому психологічній сутності ми є орієнтовані на evidence-based підходи, тобто нас цікавить КПТ, ми працюємо над тим, щоб імплементувати елементи EMDR-терапії, ми орієнтовані на mindfulness підхід, тобто те, що в світі психології є перевіреним і працюючим. Те, на що ми теж орієнтуємося і що дає можливість робити наш стартап, ми маємо власний відділ відеопродакшену і власний відділ графічних дизайнерів. І ми можемо дуже якісно поєднувати графічну картинку з відео, що додає багато українського контексту і багато розуміння війни. І, звичайно, в Україні на сьогодні ми намагаємося працювати про-боно або на проєктній основі. розуміючи, в якому стані є переважна більшість реабілітаційних закладів, ми намагаємося орієнтуватися саме на такий підхід. І, звичайно, ще одною особливістю програми є, тут ми абсолютно солідарні із тим, про що говорив Скіп, це є орієнтація на терапевтів, або принаймні на те, що це є повністю асистована активність. Тобто це не є це не є B2C рішення, це є, власне, реабілітаційне рішення, яке підрозуміває те, що шоломом керує терапевт або асистент з попереднім інструктажем терапевта. Так, зараз. Скажіть, чи змінився слайд? Супер. Ну і власне так, цілями і фокусами нашої програми є в першу чергу психоедукація, це є стабілізація стану і тренування певних психологічних навичок, яке це ми робимо за рахунок певних доказових методів, зокрема певні елементи mindfulness, тобто це не є пряма екстраполяція стандартних mindfulness програм, а скоріше такі навики mindfulness, які перекладені мовою VR. Так само мовою віртуальної реальності ми перекладаємо CBT-техніки, і знову-таки те, про що я говорила, намагаємося адаптувати певні рішення з EMDR-терапії. Ми орієнтовані на відновлення ресурсності, на відновлення власної спроможності і обов'язково наголошуємо на травмоінформованому підході, який у нас виражається в дуже багатьох речах, і в тому, як ми розробляємо ролики, ну, от буквально все, починаючи від там елементів звуку, елементів освітлення, елементів картинки, сюжетів і так далі для різних завдань різні сюжети, і ми розуміємо, наскільки це є зараз дуже важливо. І, власне, те, на кого ми орієнтовані, це є цивільні з наслідками стресу або травми, і військові та ветерани. На сьогодні ми маємо дещо вже є реалізоване, дещо є в процесі апробації. В першу чергу це є програма розвитку стресостійкості для діючих військових. Вона реалізується спільно з Академією сухопутних військ. Це є набір стабілізаційних практиків і практики менеджменту болю. Це є психоедукаційні інтерактивні практики, ми їх називаємо skills. Є практики з mindfulness, і ми працюємо на те, щоб покращувати когнітивні функції, увагу і пам'ять. В майбутньому, я сподіваюся, найближчому, у нас заплановано вивчення можливостей для експозиції, бо ми розуміємо контекст української війни і те, що не все може бути стандартизоване чи перекладене з інших джерел, і, скажімо, складність в Україні реалізації експозиційних технік через певні нюанси з тим, хто здійснює психологічний супровід. Ми плануємо імплементацію біофідбеку і так само програми, які би включали не повністю, але елементи фізичної реабілітації, хоча б в якомусь базовому вимірі. І, власне, що на сьогодні? Більше ніж рік ми працюємо в Україні. Маємо на сьогодні мережу абсолютно чудових партнерств. Це більше, ніж 30 клінік. Навчальна програма у партнерстві з Академією сухопутних військ, про яку я вже згадувала. Інтерактивні вправи у VR, які будуються на графіці або поєднання відео з графікою. Маємо постійне наповнення бібліотеки стабілізаційних вправ з елементами mindfulness. Це є такі більше вправи, які пасивне споглядання, коли людина дивиться, і це насправді теж виправдовується, тому що достатньо велика частина наших реабілітантів, вона не має можливості проходити інтерактивні вправи. І, власне, маємо накопичення даних для сьогодні для того, щоб працювати над експозицією, і ми проводимо кілька серій проводили randomized clinical trials, зокрема на базі клінічного госпіталю Лісова Поляна, де ми маємо дуже хороші promising багатообіцяючі результати, які стосуються зменшення тривожності і проявів депресивності, і проявів реактивності, як основних стрес-асоційованих симптомів. Ну, власне, на картинці ми бачимо камера, хто не знає, така кругленька штука на штативі. Це є камера, яка знімає відеоролики 360. І це є стоп-кадр з музею медуз і стоп-кадр з нашого ролика з кониками. І я хочу показати, ой-ой-ой, зараз, я перепрошую, зараз я попробую, секундочку, зараз спробую показати відео наше. Чомусь воно не, чому ж ти не хочеш запускатися? Перепрошую, давайте, може, так, попробуємо. Це є такий елемент з нашої вправи для тренування уваги, інтерактивна квіточка. Це є наші природні краєвиди, Карпати. Зокрема, ця вправа називається «Квітучі Карпати», це коники. Це про ресурси і самоспівчуття наша така маленька практика є. Це музей медуз. Він насправді теж цікаво має історію, він комусь дуже заходить, а комусь яскраві кольори тоді ми змінюємо. Це є інтерактивна практика, когнітивно-поведінкова практика «Стоп», стій, тримай дихання, озирнись, плануй і дій. І це відбувається в формі гри для засвоєння цієї практики і можливості попрактикувати, коли накриває. Власне, ми тут бачимо поєднання графіки, і за вікном є відеореалістичний пейзаж. Я перепрошую, чомусь не хоче в режимі презентації запускатися. І, власне, те, на що ми плануємо, ми закінчили фазу дослідження апробацій, і зараз у нас є дуже така інтенсивна фаза, коли ми розширюємо нашу програму. І в планах така розширення програми по пейн-менеджменту, по відновленню, тобто фактично, що відбулося, за рік ми випрацювали, як це повинно працювати. За рік ми маємо дуже чітке уявлення, до чого ми хочемо прийти. За рік ми маємо базу, на якій ми працюємо, і зараз з тим всім ми переходимо в наступну фазу активного розширення і розвитку. І, власне, ось таке. Це є одна з наших улюблених, і всі дуже люблять наші клієнти. Вправа називається Bubbles або бульбашки. Це теж є елемент mindfulness, коли ми пропонуємо клієнту і вам вибрати собі бульбашку, там є певні інструкції, і за нею послідкувати. Якщо бульбашка зникає, там спробувати віднайти її чи послідкувати за нею ще. І насправді така проста вправа абсолютно чудово працює і на переключення, і на включення уваги, і на залучення в терапію. Тобто це такі доволі прості речі, які мають абсолютно чудовий вплив. І, власне, наші партнерства на сьогодні це є клініка Unbroken, клініка Superhumans, клініка Лісова Поляна, якій ми дуже вдячні за таку довгу і плідну співпрацю, бо це є наш такий основний майданчик, де ми приносимо все нове і там разом пробуємо. Реабілітаційна програма для жінок і мам, які є постраждалими від війни, «Незламна мама», мережа хабів «Восток СОС», Мальтійська служба допомоги, клініки, які вони супроводжують, мережа СЕТА, відома в Україні, і, власне, академічне партнерство – це є «Вікно», військовий інститут Київського національного університету, УКУ і Інститут соціальної і політичної психології. Власне, на цьому у мене все. Я думаю, що я вклалася в час. Дуже дякую вам за увагу.
Оля, там питання від Скіпа в чаті. Шановні слухачі, будь ласка, давайте питання, якщо у вас є, ви можете вмикати мікрофони і ставити їх, або писати в чаті, і тоді ми їх прочитаємо.
Можна?
Звісно, нужно.
Hello, I would speak in English, just to be more familiar with Skip. First of all, big thanks, both Skip and Olga. I'd really like to talk more and more and more. Well, I'm actually also from the Institute of Social and Political Science. I'm the first year PhD student, but my background is fully mathematical and I'm data scientist. I bought my first VR headset, MetaQuest 3, and I really like the experience. And my topic of research actually is treatment of PTSD, but more focused on social aspects. And with all the AI generation, all the fears and so on could be generated. But almost all aspects you both talked about is more about one particular, like the treatment person. What, from my perspective, the readaptation, reintegration, rehabilitation part, the huge part of it is on the shoulders of society, actually, not the person themselves. And how the question to Skip, how to generate like real world samples, because everyone, when they return from to home, will have their own bubbles. Some could return to well treatment family, others could be treated not very well because of I don't know, some biases of their children from the school, because your father or something like crazy, and all these samples like from the real world, how you include them, and maybe you have some points here. Skip.
Well, I would say that you have to accept that we're doing very complex work. Psychological problems are not just one to one. There are many factors that contribute to the current state of a patient. And so this is one of the reasons I spend a lot of time talking about what are the clinical processes that simulation technology can deliver, so that eventually there is a clinician has not just one system with one application, but has a toolbox. And depending on the specific needs of the patient, whether it has to do with their early childhood experiences, or whether it's due to something that happened last week, or whether it's due to social isolation, that we have a variety. And this is why I made such a strong point about having a clinician in the loop. We're not at the point where AI is going to do it for us. AI is a great tool, and it will help support in data science, obviously, help support our understanding and help us to develop certain types of content that are relevant, help us conceptualize a treatment plan, perhaps based on a scouring of the evidence that's available in all journals, something I would never have time to be able to do. But when it comes to the end point, the tip of the spear, where you're working with somebody who's suffering from trauma, you still need that human to interpret it, to share the experience, to provide empathy, and to have a clinical toolbox that has all these different things. I mean, I love the stuff that Olga was showing, because it shows another take on how we can produce options for folks. And I hope that addressed your question, because we are doing something very complex here. And there's no, when we read about PTSD, we read the four core symptoms and, the textbook definition. there's very seldom does it ever follow the textbook definition. People are so complex, and we need to have a toolbox. So, Olga, what
Yeah,
do you say?
yeah. I mean, actually, Olga could add the point, and I would definitely would love to stay in touch. I actually cited your meta-analysis work for 2008 in my first draft.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another citation.
Yeah, I will reach you, Olga, later, and you, Skip, also, and big thanks, actually, big thanks.
Your review in Upper Handbook is just great. So we cite it a lot. Thank you, Skip.
I'm not sure if you're aware of my colleagues in Kiev, Oksana and Olya at the institute I mentioned. I will put their emails in the chat here as soon as I can get this up. Here we go. Um, and that way, if you want to reach out to them, or I can do an introduction because I think what you've built, Olga, I think it's I think they would find it of value, and I think the more we bring all this together, the better that we're going to be able to serve the unique needs of everybody that is suffering.
Yeah, we know Oksana. We met
Oh,
her, but we didn't reach to
Oksana,
topic about her.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I know from other track, so I don't, till recent time I didn't know they are into VR, into your project. So it's very interesting for me to discover it, and I think it will be great to communicate with you and later and with them, of course.
Yep, and hopefully we'll meet in person because I'm planning on finding a date where once we have a few more of our trauma-focused scenarios built, then I'll be coming to Ukraine with a clinician with a lot of experience using it here in the United States. The two of us do trainings, and we'll come to Kyiv and do a training on how to do it, how to use these tools, and um, I want to try to bring my colleague from Bucharest as well. He's willing to come, and maybe Barbara Rothbaum from Emory. She expressed an interest, so we may be able to organize a little gathering of like-minded souls.
Супер. Колеги, будь ласка, ставте питання, поки нас є. Ми вже перетримали наших синхроністів. Вони у нас героїчні, молодці, тримаються, але давайте. Якщо є питання, будь ласка, ставте.
I have one more question just yeah, about audio. It's really important, but does it cover special audio, like when you have the direction you can hear? Because some devices are like Apple Vision Pro is more costly, but still providing you more immersive experience. And what tracking is the first question, and second question is um, what tracking metrics are the most important, like eye tracking or movement, or from your experience, just as I said, I'm mostly interested in PTSD treatment, but any comments?
I would say that with the audio, first off, one of the reasons why we felt it would be good to give our Brave Mind software package to a developer in Ukraine was because we already have content that can be modified, but we have a lot of audio and some audio, in fact, that was captured in war zones in Iraq. We had an audio anthropologist go, and he embedded with a squad and captured the sounds of AK-47s, incoming, outgoing, helicopters from the inside, outside, different types of explosions, and so on. So we have a very powerful sound library, as well as human sounds and so on, that I think has some relevance. The sound of an AK-47 is the same no matter where you are. So we've got really good audio that is ready to go into the application. I think more customizable audio captured in Ukrainian language and so on, I think is what needs to be done, and that's part of the process for us. So I think that is an important thing. Um, but we have a good start on that. Now, what was your second question? I'm blanking on the second question. I'm having a senior
About
moment.
tracking metrics, like
Oh,
I'm.
yeah, yeah. Well, I was at a brain conference this week in Texas, and there was a number of groups that are developing complex, large database metrics for eye tracking that can be brought to bear. And there's a company called, I think it's called Sense Eyes, that claims to be able to diagnose PTSD from interaction in a headset with eye tracking devices in the headset on a set of tasks. How long do you focus on certain elements and so on? I don't know any of their data, so I don't know if they're just making claims. But eye tracking necessarily is a tool, a good measure. And we haven't been able to do it as much previously because it was expensive, it was complicated. But now eye tracking with many headsets, it's part of the package, like the Vision Pro that you mentioned. It's built in. You might not be able to get the data from Apple, but there are other devices like the HP Omnicept headset that has heart rate from the pad on the front of the headset and eye tracking and pupillary dilation. Um, and it has an APK, that SDK that allows you to easily get that data, because that's always been the problem. Psychologists sometimes are not experts in psychophysiology or in complex measurement like that. And so now having software packages that can do it and you can test hypotheses this way, I think is going to open up a lot of opportunity. Like the startle response. Do we find a certain eye movement precedes a startle or follows it after? I mean, these are all hypotheses to be tested. And what we have with new capabilities using VR as a simulation tool to systematically deliver stimuli, we also have the capability to measure these behaviors, whether it's eye tracking or motor movement or heart rate variability or whatever. So I think it's transformational, not just the coolness of using virtual reality, but the idea of the ultimate Skinner box. We have a transformational technology here. It's emotionally evocative, and I think it's going to advance the science now that it's more usable and lower cost.
Yeah, big thanks for the answer. Actually, with nowadays kind of modern war with all the FPV and other drones with camera, you can, and other software which can generate from the footage the scenes, you can build more realistic 3D scenes, and it will be actually the battlefield because you already have those footages. It's not all of them are publicly available, but still, yeah. Well, yeah, big thanks. Actually, I really would love to stay in touch, so I will ping you sometime later.
I'm going to put in the chat. I just looked up the website for Sensei that you might find interesting. Here's their website. They did a pretty good talk at this brain conference that I was attending. but I haven't dug into, their research, so I don't know for sure.
Олеже, у вас була рука. Ви хотіли
Так, у
питання
мене
поставити?
та-да, у мене є питання. Я перше хочу подякувати Скіп і Ольга за ваші роботи, за те, що ви робите і створюєте ці продукти. Це дуже багатообіцяючі результати. Це дійсно те, що зараз дуже потрібно. Моє питання про те, як ви плануєте розширювати мережу там центрів чи клінік для своїх досліджень. Тому що от я працюю в центрі, де проходять реабілітацію військові і цивільні, і у мене є питання, які умови для того, щоб, наприклад, цей центр можна було підключити там до програми, і на яких умовах це робиться, там, як закуповуються матеріали, там, програми, з ким це можна контактувати, бо поки що ми працюємо тим, що є, а можливості цього менше, ніж те, що пропонуєте ви.
Дивіться, я напевно дозволю собі тут першою сказати. Я думаю, що ми можемо з вами сконтактувати, і в нас є вже якби налагоджена схема, як ми працюємо, і можемо працювати.
Чудово, дякую.
Yeah, and I agree. I put my the emails from my collaborators in the chat in Ukraine. I think, me being in Los Angeles, I can't manage this too much. I can provide recommendations from my past experience disseminating software across the United States. But I think my Ukrainian colleagues there would be more relevant. But I, certainly will. If you want to reach out to me, I can introduce you to them as well. Or I'm putting together a larger scale package. I'm writing a chapter right now on all this work that will summarize, who and what and why. And that's why, Olga, I would like to get some content from you to include in my chapter, as well. But I want to make it so that, there's a document that somebody can go to and say, all right, I have a patient with this. Oh, here's an application. Here's where it's located. Here's what you need. I'll be honest, though, I'm really frustrated. I thought that in the United States, I would find people that would be willing to donate to support the efforts in Ukraine, and I'm having a harder time than I thought. But this stuff doesn't get built always for free. I mean, we've gotten a lot of progress done. A lot of people have donated significant amounts of effort and time, but in order to properly disseminate a healthcare program, there needs to be, somebody that, is kind of in charge of, the whole picture. Somebody that loses sleep at night worrying about, does this center have this software? Oh, what about this headset? Can I get Meta to donate 20 headsets to this center so that they don't have to worry about purchasing them? These kinds of things, the answer to 99 of 100 questions always comes back to money, unfortunately. So if you guys ever hear of foundations that are willing to help support this kind of work, I would love to hear about them. We've raised, like I said, I think we've raised about $11,000 in the United States, and all of that money now has gone to the software developer in Ukraine to pay her team to continue moving forward.
Так, давайте я буду авторитарно казати, що вже 2 години ми сидимо і перетримали всіх. Я скажу, що це ініціатива не тільки форпоста, а великої кількості волонтерів. І що наші американські колеги і наші українські колеги всі разом зібрались для того, щоб цей проєкт робити можливим. Я дуже дякую лектору нашому, дуже дякую Джиму. Карлу його сьогодні немає, також дякую. Сьогодні у нас 2 прекрасні перекладачі, і їм дуже дякую. Записи будуть на площадках форпоста, так, і контакти ви бачили Скіпа, ви бачите, що Скіп дуже відкритий до комунікації, це круто. Давайте цим користатися і налагоджувати цю співпрацю. Дякую. Так. Гарного вечора всім. Скіп дуже дякую. Thank you. It was fantastic. Just the way it was
You
last
have
time.
my talk, by the way. You have the talk with
Yes,
all
I
the
do.
videos. So if anybody
Yes,
wants any of that,
I do.
feel free to share it. And I would love a link to when the talk is
Так.
available for the video.
Англійська презентація Скіпа зі всіма відео є у мене, тому якщо вам цікаво, будь ласка, дайте знати, ви бачите ж всі оголошення, це, то я вам перешлю. Там всі ці відео встроєні, вбудовані, як правильно сказати. І англійське відео з наступного разу, а можливо і це вже відео буде розміщене на площадці APA Military Division 19, для того, щоб наші американські колеги також могли дивитися, і ми цей діалог також розширимо. Мирного вечора, колеги, бережіть себе, будь ласка.
Дякую. Щасливо.
Stay safe. Thanks and bye.
Бачення.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes.
See you again.